Hi everyone, we're going to spend a few minutes talking about crisis theory today, which is sometimes also called crisis intervention. We'll get to the, historical context here in a second, but let's just spend a minute talking about sort of what this theory, what this theory does. So down here in this bottom section, this is sort of the heart of crisis theory here. Really, what Caplan, the guy who developed crisis theory, was arguing was that in a state of active crisis, you have an opportunity to either return to a higher level of functioning through help and assistance, or you have the opportunity to return really to a lower level of functioning or a non-level of functioning. And that really is a result of this moment of crisis. We'll talk about what crisis here is in a second. But this is sort of a good, if dated, process model here. So let's just move on here a little bit. So, Gerald Caplan developed crisis theory in the 1960s. He was working, really in the shadow of psychoanalytic and sort of existentialism and humanism and CBT and family systems. And really, the reason he developed crisis theory was the result of a couple of very specific crises. I've got pictures here in a second. And then the result of some more sort of big and abstract historical forces. So, so Caplan was working in the 50s and 60s. We're in the aftermath of World War II. People are still thinking about the Great Depression. And these things, things like the Great Depression and World War II were not acute crises. They didn't happen in an instant. They were protracted, drawn out conflicts that had a lot of emotions sort of attached to them. And this was especially true at the end of World War II when concentration and death camps were liberated, and the full extent of what was going on in Nazi Germany became apparent. We then get things like the Coconut Grove fire and the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. These were Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. These were acute crises that resulted in massive destruction and massive loss of life in a very, very short amount of time. So Coconut Grove was a restaurant, nightclub kind of thing. And it caught fire and part of the floor caved in from one to the other. Same thing happened at Triangle Shirtwaist fire. Triangle Shirtwaist was in the northeast. They made shirts and the building caught fire. So these were much more acute crises, and these were things that Gerald Caplan was thinking about it. The other thing that was going on, he was responding to sort of deinstitutionalization, criticism of institutionalized care. We'll talk about this in a second, and a need for less expensive treatment options. So institutionalization at this point was an expensive, sort of never-ending kind of care, where people essentially were housed in psychiatric institutions for a long time. These are let me move myself out of the way here. These are pictures of some of what these institutions would look like. So there's the Buffalo Psychiatric Center is up in the top left there. One of these other ones is the Warren, I believe it's this one, is the Warren Psychiatric Hospital. But I think I think this is the facility that was formerly Van Dyke, or that is now Van Dyke in the Finger Lakes. But this is often where people with and then so this is Coconut Grove, and then this is Buffalo Psychiatric again. These two are Buffalo Psychiatric. This is Coconut Grove as well, here on the left. But these were often, so these psychiatric facilities were often state-run. They were large. They were in park-like settings, and that's because in the 30s, 40s, and even before then, really, that was understood to be the best way to care for people with severe mental illness. But at this time, we start to see that institutional care is really expensive. We get some significant concerns about the differential of power between the patients and the psychiatrists or the nurses, the people who were sort of managing them. Excuse me. We get this concern that institution-based care actually creates patients, and then we get the development of psychotropic medication. So we don't need necessarily to sequester people with mental health problems. And so it was really at the nexus of all of these things, and let me just move myself so you can see that last point there. It's really at the nexus of all these things that Caplan was working and thinking. So we have sort of knowledge of crises, both acute and protracted. Obviously, the protracted coming from the Great Depression and World War II, and the acute crises coming from things like natural disasters, Coconut Grove fire, that kind of thing. And then at the same time, we get these concerns about psychiatric care and a need to shift towards sort of lower cost interventions. And that's really where crisis intervention comes in. So let me just go back here for a second to the very beginning slide here for a second. And so if we go back to this, what we really see in crisis intervention is that there's a moment, loosely defined, a moment though when people need help from a professional. And the whole point of that moment of help is to return them to this higher level of functioning, which in turn means that when they get back up here to this normal level of functioning, when the next crisis happens, they'll have more ability to tolerate whatever that crisis is going to be. They'll have more coping skills. They'll have greater distress tolerance, that kind of thing. So this is, so Caplan was always trying to get people out to this higher level of functioning and prevent this from happening. Because if we don't help people and they go to this lower level of functioning, that's when they're going to need those expensive institutional forms of care. And so he saw this really as a vicious cycle, right? And on the other hand, if we could help people over here, he saw that as really a virtuous cycle. So let me get back to where we were. Okay. So for Caplan, he really saw crises as significant moments that disrupted a person's life. So death of a loved one, loss of a job, loss of a home, loss of freedom, moving from one developmental stage to another, illness, relapse, abuse. He didn't necessarily limit what was termed a crisis. Interestingly, Caplan actually thought that a crisis was one of the things that could be defined by a person, and although other people didn't necessarily agree with him, he saw something. He saw crisis really as something that people could sort of define on their own. So other things could be a crisis as well, a pregnancy, a jail term, something to do with a loan, especially a significant amount of money when it comes to a house or a business or something like that. Beginning school or ending school, vacation, holidays, a child leaving home. He actually didn't really make much of a distinction between a crisis and a disaster. To him, they were really one and the same. But this also gets us to one of the sort of limitations of crisis theory, and that's that it's really exclusively a micro theory. It doesn't say much about intervening on the meso or macro levels. It's exclusively sort of a human behavior theory. So Caplan, though, did argue for sort of four big umbrella categories of crises: situational crises, disaster crises, which would be something like the Coconut Grove fire or some other kind of natural disaster, a developmental crises, and then a transitional crisis. So developmental would be moving from one developmental stage from another, and a transitional crisis would be transitioning from one sort of thing to another. So an example of that might be transitioning, out of psychiatric care, out of a hospital, or out of jail, or something like that. And for Caplan, the kinds of crises really depended on sort of an individual's life circumstances as well. So people would experience different kinds of crises based on their socioeconomic status, their work, their ambitions, and things like that. So this is, if we had to draw a picture of crisis theory, I'll put myself up here, I guess. If we had to draw a picture of crisis theory, this is sort of what's going on. So crisis theory would be this bottom one here, and it's at these points when our circumstances, our life circumstances, overwhelm our ability to cope and react, that we need intervention. This one on the top here would the allegory here is that our life circumstances might take us to the edge of our ability to cope, but they're not overwhelming that ability to cope. This, of course, the question I have down at the bottom is another one of the criticisms of crisis theory, and that criticism really is: are we helping people grow as a result of crisis, or are we merely restoring functioning? And we don't always know, because we can't always predict what would happen had professional intervention not happened. So, although at the beginning crisis was initially about sort of putting people back together, it was later on that it became this idea that we could help people grow and increase functioning. Didn't mean to go ahead real quick. So that really came as a result of Gerald Caplan thinking about this idea that change happens at the intersection, or the nexus, of danger and opportunity. So danger obviously is sort of that moment of crisis, or the aftermath of crisis, and the opportunity really comes from interacting with a professional in order to create growth. So Caplan really saw danger as this moment where people could either sort of choose to move towards growth, or choose to move towards a lower level of functioning. If you think back to that first chart in the presentation. So these are sort of four specific and sort of manualized ways of dealing with crises. Over here we have James and Gilliland. They have a 6-step crisis intervention model that involves listening, assessing, and acting. This one here is Robert's 7-stage crisis model. This is Cannell's ABC model. The ABC, of course, is sort of nice because it's easy to remember. It's achieving and attending, boiling down to basics, and then coping. So that's sort of nicely easy to remember. And then there's Meyer's triage model over here. You're welcome to pause the video if you want and take a few notes on these. Like I said, these are really process models. And the point of these models is to think about whether they restore functioning or whether they enhance functioning. And so for example, the ABC model, although it's really, really simple and sort of only 3 steps, if it's done right, it can help enhance functioning. However, if it's just done sort of poorly or without much effort, it could restore functioning. Restoring functioning isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it doesn't sort of maximize the moment of opportunity that the crisis presents. So change happens, like I said, at the nexus of danger and opportunity. They are opportunities for growth. Clients are vulnerable during these times. They're willing to receive help from assistance from others during a crisis, especially from a person who's not in that crisis with them. And so it really becomes the job of the worker, the social worker, the helping professional to offer assistance and help a client grow. Kaplan seemed to feel that change happened 4 to 6 weeks after that sort of crisis moment. For him, that 4 to 6 weeks period was after an acute crisis, so not a protracted and abstract crisis, but something that was pretty acute. Let me just move this real quick. Okay, the screen's a little bit better, or a little bit bigger, so we can see all the words now. So crisis intervention has been used in emergency psychiatric programs, school-based programs, community response teams, especially teams that are sort of responding to the severely and persistently mental ill, or suicidal ideation. It's been used in hotlines and in shelters as well. Crisis theory is useful because it's very time limited, so it really only happens from that moment of crisis to 6 or 8 weeks after. So it's time limited, which means it's not really all that expensive, and that's why some people like it. But it's vulnerable to attack or criticism, I should say, when we don't necessarily have a crisis to sort of pinpoint on. People don't always need a crisis in order to seek help. There are some gaps in the research, though. There is, and so I just mentioned one of them. It's not really a macro phenomena. We don't really have a group intervention for crisis. It's really sort of a one-on-one or at best a two-on-one kind of thing. And there's also sort of a big cultural competence component to crisis theory as well, and that's that crises of some groups have been merely dismissed as things that aren't crises. They're not disasters. They're things that didn't really influence that particular group. Here, of course, I'm referring to sort of intergenerational trauma, maybe that American Indian and First Nation groups have felt or have experienced. Things that other marginalized groups have experienced. But if we remember sort of Kaplan's idea, it was really up to the group, it was really up to the person to sort of identify what had caused a crisis. There wasn't really this sort of external definition of crisis that had to be met. Crisis intervention actually serves as a nice unifying point for a variety of different helping professionals. There is some evidence to suggest that it prevents hospitalizations, especially in those community response teams. It can reduce length of stay. That's what LOS is during subsequent hospitalizations. And there actually is some good evidence to suggest that crisis intervention does build coping mechanisms. And that is essentially evidence that we can enhance functioning after that moment of crisis. The other things, sort of more abstract things that crisis theory has done, is it sort of validated that unifying of assessment and treatment that social workers are sort of known for. It reduced the wait times between request and actual delivery of services, and that's because assessment and treatment were happening in the moment. And it also really leveraged a client's sort of natural resiliency as part of treatment. There are some times when this theory aligns with the profession, times when it doesn't. I think the incongruities are pretty interesting. One of the things that Crisis sets up is really the helper is the expert, so it doesn't necessarily value the expertise a client has in his or her life. And that's because at this moment of crisis, right, people are vulnerable, they're amenable to assistance and change, and they're really looking for expertise at that point. Here's just a summary of the strengths and weaknesses of crisis intervention, and I believe that is just about it. Oh, multiculturalism here real quick. Just to conclude with a few thoughts about cultural competence and multiculturalism. Help seeking or one's amenable to help, or one's being amenable to help, is very much informed by culture and by gender. Trust in that system is also very much informed by culture. So again, this assumption that people are going to be open to change in a moment of crisis is not always true. And there are times when people might even become sort of more entrenched in their ability to take care of problems themselves during crisis. And at that point, the worker really needs to ask themselves, well, what is it that we're doing? You know, is it appropriate to help someone? Is it appropriate to force someone to take help, or should we let them sort of deal with things on their own without help? Then, of course, issues of shame are relevant. Accepting help can be a difficult thing to do, and it often means acknowledging that there is a crisis for some people, which sort of precipitates shame. This feeling that something is, especially if it's sort of not an external crisis, but a situational crisis or a developmental crisis, even a transitional crisis. There's this idea that I don't have control over my life, and I need help to manage it. And then, of course, this idea that help is really becoming more like the dominant culture, and this is actually becoming less true as sort of multiculturalism and cultural competence really becomes more of a guiding force in social work. Increasingly, even when people do crisis interventions, we're relying on cultural values and cultural information as a source of strength, and so that's probably a good thing for both clients and for crisis theory. Okay, that's it. Thank you for watching.